Right, let's get started. Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back to the Hot Politics Lab 2022. I think it's our fourth or maybe even fifth year running. I'm not really keeping the count, but it's really marvelous to have a great program again for the coming 6 months and already a large list of participants today. So welcome to all of you. For those of you new here today, we typically have 20 to 25-minute talks, after which we have a Q&A. And all our meetings are recorded, so you can listen or watch it on Spotify or YouTube. Just Google Spotify or Hot Politics Lab and you'll find us. Today we have a super interesting speaker, Marte Otten. She's a cognitive neuroscientist and currently assistant professor at the Department of Social Psychology at the UvA. And I'm particularly excited to have her because she really her presence really touches upon what this lab is all about, is to look at research that is very relevant to us, for us political scientists, communication scientists, but that is not actually from that particular discipline. And as I announced, she works at the University of Amsterdam, so she actually does work. She works physically normally. I mean, we're all at home now, but in the office. You're in the office, I think. Yeah. So she works physically very close to us, but typically, at least until a year ago or so, I don't think we even knew each other. And so this is therefore it's particularly relevant to have people like you here in our lab to cross these bridges between the disciplines. And in this case, it's literally crossing a bridge, because in order to get to your office, I have to cross a bridge either over the water or the one at the fourth floor. Marte's work, if I may summarize it probably in the wrong way, is very roughly about the impact of words on the one hand. So, for example, she's worked on humiliations and praises, and I found a wonderful video by the Universiteit van Nederland, University of the Netherlands, where in the name of science, Marte humiliates and insults a very well-known lifestyle YouTuber I have never heard of. It's a wonderful video. I will share it in the chat later on. If you want to know more about Marte's work. But I think what she'll talk about today is a different branch of her research, namely what knowledge of the world, the knowledge of the world we have does to our perceptions and cognitions. And so without further ado, Marte, I want to give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was one of the weirder emails I got, indeed, when they asked me if I wanted to work with this YouTuber. I also never heard of, I'm too old, but if I talk to younger people, they're, oh, Masha, yes, so, well, whatever. Didn't say anything for me, but it was fun. So anyway, today I won't talk about insulting people, but I will talk about how social knowledge that we have, including perhaps political convictions, might change very basic cognitive processes, such as in this case, visual perception, which, in my opinion, is very much the cornerstone of how we interact and perceive the world. So this is a question that I am really interested in. The reason why I got here was because of my interest in prejudice and stereotypes. And there are rather big claims in that field that once you have a certain stereotype about a group, that might not just change how you interact with that group, but also how you perceive individuals from that group. And this got me thinking about how much our social knowledge can really change sort of these very basic steps of our cognition. So let me see, yeah, here. So when I think about politics, obviously, it's very different from having stereotypes on the one hand, or prejudice, but on the other hand, it's not that far removed. Once we have a certain political conviction, this might come with ideas about people from the other side of the political spectrum, people that we know, well-known politicians, for example, but also maybe people that we don't know, people from which sort of the entire group of people who adhere to other political convictions than the ones that we ourselves adhere to. So obviously, within politics, smearing campaigns and that sort of thing are not unknown. So talking about the other in very negative terms is something that happens. The question is, do these kinds of ideas about the other that are being communicated, do these not only change how we feel about other people, how we think about other people, but also really how we see them? So we can ask the question, do these attitudes, these convictions, these political convictions that we have, can they shape perception? So if we, for example, think about somebody, a woman, politician, perhaps, from a party that we agree with, we might think, have a sort of general conviction that this is a fun woman, this is a nice woman. But if this is a woman from a party that we do not agree with, maybe we have the preconception that she is a bit of a nasty person, consisting with the stereotype of a witch, for example, something that is often used to talk about female politicians. So if we have these two stereotypes in different people, does that actually change, how you actually see that politician when you have this political conviction that either is very positive or very negative? So there are cognitive models about this. One influential cognitive model.
Marte, I'm not sure if you're flipping through your PowerPoint, but we're not seeing that.
Oh no, that's awful. I am actually. So what are you seeing now?
Yeah, now you flip through, but maybe you want to enlarge this.
Oh, so what I'm seeing on my screen is that I am sharing. So.
Marte, druk even op de presentatiemodus, denk ik.
Sorry? Staat de presentatiemodus nu?
Yeah, but I think that's not the screen you're sharing, I think.
That's it.
You're sharing sort of the basic PowerPoint screen.
Okay, I am trying again. Sorry about this. Zoom. So I am share screen. Is it now on diaforstelling? Still not?
It's still the same.
Okay. Should have checked beforehand.
Maybe you start it first in presentation mode, and then
Yeah.
you select that screen when you share your screen.
Try it again. See if it's. Problem is, once I get out of my presentation mode, I can't share it anymore. So I'm going to try this, and then. Oh God, this is awful. Let me just restart my whole presentation. Work?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I had been showing you all these nice pictures, but you didn't know. I can start again, but do it really quickly. So if we have political convictions, obviously there are some ideas that are being communicated about good and bad, and this might influence what we see in the other side. And if we have political convictions, for example, in the Netherlands, about certain female politicians, if we agree with that female politician, we might think of her as a nice and fun person. This is what we see here, a nice and fun person. Actually, in fact, when I Googled fun woman to get a picture of a fun woman, Google asked me, "Do you not mean funny man?" I thought that was like really excellent from Google. Anyway, so we have fun woman on the one hand, fun woman politician. On the other hand, we have witch politician. If we have these preconceptions, does that change how we see a certain politician? Well, there are so I can actually do this a lot quicker than I did the first time. So there are these cognitive models about perception. And there's one cognitive model, sort of the traditional cognitive model, where there is basically no room for pre-existing knowledge to shape perception. So these models are really close to the idea of cognitive impenetrability, where any background knowledge that we already have only changes our basic perception very late in the game. So if we think about this model within political perception, we have a stimulus, something in the outside world that we, in this case, perceive through our eyes. If we perceive something, there is a neural signal which reaches sensory regions, in this case, the visual cortex. So there is a representation in the brain, a sensory representation. This automatically generates a perception, right? So this is the conscious representation of what we have seen. And only then is there perhaps a role for prior knowledge. So if we think about the example that I just gave, if you maybe don't really agree with this particular politician, you might have a negative connotation, which might influence the way you think about this person, but it doesn't change the way you see this person, like the actual visual processing of this person. On the other hand, if you have a positive connotation, again, this might influence the way you respond to, think about this person, but it doesn't change how you physically perceive this person. So there is a role, these kinds of models, for background knowledge, right? Background knowledge can change how you respond to a certain stimulus, only the level of interpretation. It doesn't change what you actually initially perceptually have processed. On the other hand, we have these generative models of perception, predictive processing models. These have become really popular in the last decade or so because this type of predictive processing at least plays a role in the very basic levels of how our brain works. So if we look at the neurons, for example, in our eye, in the retina, we see that predictions about what neuron is most likely going to be perceiving, those change the signal that is actually being processed in that neuron. So this has sort of created this wave within perception research and theoretical work about perception, that perhaps this doesn't only happen at these sort of very, very early stages of perception, but also in later levels of perception, where we integrate everything we see and perceive in the world into this complete perception. So if we think about the example that I just gave again, we have the stimulus in the outside world that enters our cognitive system. It leads to sensory activation, but at the same time, we have prior knowledge. For example, this is actually a pretty good, it leads to predictions about the person of Sigrid, and together forms the perception. On the other hand, you have maybe negative associations with person of Sigrid Kaag, you might have these predictions about how she will appear in the real world. Within a model like this, a generative predictive processing model, these predictions are integrated with the actual sensory information, leading to a percept that mixes these priors, these predictions, with sensory information that is actually gathered from the world. So interestingly, when I tried to make a morph of the witch in Sigrid Kaag, I felt that this looked much more like Maggie Gyllenhaal than, well, a witchy Sigrid Kaag, but that is completely besides the point. What I'm trying to get across here is that within this model, there is a role for existing knowledge, not just shape the way we respond to the world, how it actually shapes how we perceive the world. So what we see in these types of approaches to cognition is determined not just by the input from the outside world, but really also what is happening inside our minds. So within this type of approach, perception can directly be altered by context. So is there any evidence for this happening in politics? Well, perhaps. I found two very interesting studies, so let's just have a quick look. So this is a study where people, Americans, were asked if a certain politician was attractive. So they had to rate the face of a politician, and the participants were either Democrats or Republicans, and the faces were of Democrat and Republican politicians. The interesting thing was people were not told whether the faces were of Democrats and Republicans, but for some faces they knew because these were famous politicians. Other faces they did not know because these were local politicians that the participants had not heard of. What you see is once they knew that the faces were of Democrats or Republicans, you see that they rated their own side as being more attractive than the other side. So there seems to be sort of, in at least what people report seeing, the knowledge of whether somebody belongs to their group politically seen or the other group politically seen really changes how these faces are rated on the attractiveness scale. Another study in Germany had to do with whether you thought about other people as being refugees or Germans. And these faces were rated on a large number of scales, whether they were assertive, egoistic, hostile, outgoing, trustworthy, likable, and intelligent. And this was combined into a sort of first impression scale. Like if you look at this face, is this generally a positive face or generally a negative face? And these German participants, they were also asked a lot of things about themselves, including their social dominance orientation. So whether they were more likely to endorse sort of strict political view or a slightly more, I don't know, socially oriented political view, right-wing authoritarianism, their actual political orientation was also measured. Well, if you look at these individual differences in right or left-wing orientation within the participants, you see that especially the refugees were, the faces of the refugees were seen very differently. The people who were on the right side of the spectrum, both on social dominance orientation, on right-wing authoritarianism, and on actual political orientation, reported seeing less trustworthiness, more egoistical faces, etc., in the refugees compared to people who were on the left side of the spectrum, whereas this was less or absolutely not the case for people they thought were German. So what we are seeing here is that ideas that people might have about others that they're seeing is this a refugee, and how do I feel about refugees? Is this a German, and how do I feel about Germans? That this seems to change at least what people report seeing. So the question now is, how do you know whether these people actually see something different? And this is very relevant because we only have people's responses to go by. And like I just showed you, these two models actually allow existing social knowledge to change people's responses. The question is, does it also change their perception? Right, so here we see that prior knowledge in sort of very traditional bottom-up model of perception, still once the percept is formed, can change the way people respond to that percept. Whereas in this predictive processing approach, the percept itself, so what people experience seeing in the world, is already changed. These are different at the perceptual level, but might not be different at the level of the response. How do you tease these two apart? Well, I'm going to show you an example, not from a political experiment, but from an experiment on very simple emotion perception. The question that I asked people was, does this face look happy or angry? Well, it's pretty simple here, but it's much more complicated if you make these morphs where there's a little bit of happiness and a little bit of anger, and you ask people to make this decision. And then when you give people a lot of examples of these faces, you can sort of estimate at what point the face for them subjectively goes from happy to angry. So I did this, but what I also did was I gave people a little bit of social background for each of the faces. I told them something that had to do with perhaps the emotional state of that particular person. So I gave a context sentence that described the person in the picture. For example, she just had a huge fight with her best friend, or she just heard a favorite song on the radio. This provides a little bit of context and perhaps a prior knowledge that can shape what people see. So I did some boring stuff with the sentences, made sure that they're all the same length and that sort of thing, that any differences between positive and negative context were not having anything to do with the sentences themselves. And then I looked at these, what is called cumulative normal psychrometric functions. Pretty boring. What you can do with that is estimate at what point in time does, for that particular person in that particular context, how much information, anger information, happiness information do they need in the face for the face to go from happy to angry? And the most relevant question for me was, does the context, the prior that people have about the face, is it a negative, is it most likely going to be a negative face, angry, or is it most likely going to be a happy face? Does it actually change the amount of physical information that people need to shift from happy to angry in their perception? And what I saw was that indeed giving people this additional information about the person in the picture changes the amount of information people need. So within a negative context, people need more anger in the face before they can shift their perception. Makes sense. So we see that there's indeed this difference depending on the context in the perception. However, this is still not completely piecing apart perception versus responding thing. It could be still that people are just slightly more inclined to respond happy after they've just read this happy sentence, and they're slightly more inclined to respond angry after they've just read the anger sentence. So what I did next was that I looked at something called signal detection theory. Signal detection theory actually really focuses on piecing apart this, on the one hand, response, and on the other hand, perception. So if you look at signal detection theory, you can look at the ability of people to pick up happiness signals, for example, in this case, in the visual stimulus that is being presented. And then you can look at something called D prime. The D prime is basically how much subjectively there is a difference between, in this case, a stimulus where happiness is present and the stimulus where no happiness is present. For the D prime, I don't think I have the pointer. Yeah, laser pointer. Can you see my laser pointer? Yes. So here we have a stimulus with some happiness in there. In a normal world, you know, there's always going to be some noise. So your ability to detect happiness will have some sort of distribution. When you're specifically attuned to picking up happiness signals compared to no happiness signals, the difference between no happiness stimulus and the happiness stimulus will be very large, relatively for your experience. Whereas perhaps within the angry context, you are less attuned to these happiness signals. So the difference, your ability to pick up happiness signals compared to no happiness signals will be small. So this is what the D prime constitutes. It's this difference between your ability to pick up happiness signals in the actual visual signal and your ability to distinguish between no happiness signals. This is D prime on the one hand. On the other hand, you have this thing called criterion shift. It might be that there's no actual change in your perception. You're just more inclined to say, yes, that face was happy. And then it doesn't matter whether the face actually was happy. You're just saying happy, happy, happy all the time. This is a criterion shift. And you pick up these two, prime on the one hand and criterion shift on the other, by looking at the types of errors people make. So if people make a lot of errors, regardless of the actual type of stimulus that they're shown, but they just say, yes, I saw a happy face all the time, then that indicates a criterion shift. If they don't make these types of errors, you know that actually, they're actually very good at distinguishing no happiness versus happy faces, then you know that you have this D prime change. So this is what I did. I asked people to look at faces, happy or angry, and basically say, was this a happy face or an angry face? And I looked at the type of errors that they made. And here, again, with context, depending on the context, there was no change in this D prime. So people were not particularly sensitive to picking up happiness cues after they just saw a happy sentence. Were not particularly attuned to picking up angry cues after they saw an angry sentence. So there were no changes there. There was no change in perceptual sensitivity. But we did see this clear criterion shift. After a happy sentence, people were much more inclined to say to any face that was a happy face. And after an anger sentence, people were much more inclined to say to any face that was an angry face. So what we're seeing here, that shift that we just observed in what seemed like perception, actually a shift in responding. So there's no change in the actual perceptual system going on. And the change is at the level of the inclination to respond positively or negatively. So that sort of goes against the whole story that I just told you, right? That social knowledge can change perception. In this case, it really couldn't. So in this case, we see that indeed the way people respond to these faces, that changes, but what people actually see, or at least their perceptual sensitivity to what they see, that doesn't change. Does this mean that political attitudes, political convictions are most likely not shaping perception? Well, I wouldn't go that far, because what I just showed you was an experiment where the stakes weren't very high, right? It wasn't personal. It was just a little bit of information about people they didn't know. So that's very different from when we think about politics. When you have strong political convictions, these are very relevant for your self-concept. They can have very high emotional valence. They are clearly linked to specific individuals which are on the right side or on the wrong side. So if we take that into account, we can, if we look at this from a predictive processing view, we can say that priors, these predictions about the world, might be a lot stronger than in the experiment that I just showed you, which was low stakes, not relevant for the self-concepts, no high emotional valence for the individual, not clearly linked to an individual or a specific group of people. It could be that the predictions are more specific and they are given more weight because of these sort of the personal involvement of people when it comes through something like political convictions. So in that regards, I would say this is still an open question. It is possible, at least it's theoretically possible. Yeah, and I am actually looking forward to doing some work on this. I think it could be fun. So I'm definitely going to recruit some students and see what I can do. Was it?
Thank you, Marte. This is a very interesting talk, and as Gijs was already hinting at it, it's nice to see how in different disciplines related questions with different theories get approached and do see some parallels in the logic that you apply, but definitely coming from a different field. So I think that's very stimulating. So here, for those of you who are new today, you can write your question in the Q&A box, and then I will read it out, and Marte will answer. While you think about your questions, I will take the freedom to ask the first question. And Marte, could you pull up that theoretical model, like that brain image that you, or that, no, not a brain image, but that stylistic brain? Yeah, here, yeah. No, that yeah, the yeah, where you have to, yeah, here. So one thing that political scientists, communication scientists think that varies is that this prior knowledge is not a constant, right? That's not a binary. Where so sometimes it might be low or high, or it might be weak or strong.
Yeah.
What does that variation, if we think about weak or strong, right? If you think about the partisan dynamics here, what would that do to the cascade of that you outline here?
Yeah. So what would change is the strength of the prior, and therefore also the strength of the prediction. But the perceptual outcome is basically, well, not a sum of predictions and sensory activation, but it is a combination. So if the sensory activation is particularly strong and the prediction is particularly weak, so you don't have this very strong bipartisan outlook, then the sensory activation will basically win, right? It will just be that you see what there is in the outside world. Whereas when you have this really strong prediction, when you have a really strong bipartisan outlook, the weight of the prediction and the specificity of your prediction will be much stronger, and therefore it will have a much larger influence on the resulting perceptual outcome. So this is, it's a pretty, yeah, it's basically just a mathematical equation in that regard. You have these distributions. If the sensory activation is relatively weak and slightly noisy, it will have less influence on the outcome of the percept. If the prediction is very specific and not noisy, then that will have a lot of influence on the outcome. So it's basically an interplay between sensory activation and the actual prediction. In that regard, yeah, the prior knowledge is not stable. It really depends on where you're at that point in time. Also, how active your prior knowledge is. So if your prior knowledge is not activated by the stimulus or by the context at that point in time, it will not influence resulting perceptual experience.
Right. Gijs, you raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Marte. I think this is a very relevant model that I'm sort of vaguely aware of, but I mean, I think most of the social sciences are still in Model A. Can you, particularly for prediction, prior knowledge, is there something meaningful to say about at what level of consciousness this operates?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, the whole model was, of course, built on very unconscious priors. If we talk about the retina, these are just sort of either innate priors or priors that you acquire very shortly after birth. These are obviously completely unconscious. When we talk about much further on in the cascade, these priors don't necessarily need to be conscious. Right, so you can acquire, for example, there is some work showing effects of priors that you acquire through unconscious learning. So through just seeing a large sequence of stimuli, for example, and some stimuli occurring more often than others. This is usually not something that people are aware of. But you do see that these types of patterns, even when people are not aware of them, they start shaping what people see or what they're able to consciously perceive subsequently. So you don't need to be aware of these priors. You don't need to be aware of your prediction for them to shape perception. But that doesn't mean, obviously, that you cannot be aware of them. There is also evidence that priors that you are aware of, that they also shape perception. I don't know if this is the answer that you were looking for, but you don't need to be aware. It doesn't need to be consciously accessible for prior knowledge to have an influence on what you're seeing or what you're perceiving within this model.
Christian.
Hey, I have a very small question. You gave this example about these context sentences that you gave participants in one slide, and you mentioned that you made sure these sentences have the same arousal. How did you make sure that this is the case?
That's a pretty boring thing that I just ask people on a 7-point scale, how arousing is this sentence? Like, probably not the best way to control it, but at least they all had the same sort of score on that 7-point scale. I think I asked like 40 people to rate all sentences. What you don't want is have sentences that are negative, but also like people almost start crying over them, whereas your positive sentences are like, yeah, well, that's bad, that's nice, but not great, right? So that's what I wanted to check. But it would be nicer if you look at skin conductance or whatever, but I didn't do any of that.
Marte, this sensory activation, right? This is where just my lack of knowledge comes in. But can you say something? Is that really causally prior to the prediction, or the moment you see something, does that automatically triggers predictions, or can we do this at the milliseconds level?
Well, so that really depends on the type of stimulus that you use. So obviously, when there's nothing in the outside world and you have no clue of what's going to happen, then a visual stimulus is presented, and it first needs to go through the entire sequence of, visual processing and the visual cortex, and then integration, and then some level of meaning added to it before you can start generating predictions and priors, because only then do you know anything about what you're seeing. But usually, in reality, you don't live in a black box where suddenly stuff appears. You live in a context where you're pretty well attuned on what you're going to see in the next 3 seconds, so to say. In that regards, it is always the case that we have some prior knowledge and some predictions about what is going to happen. So if we talk about sequences of events, obviously, once the stimulus is there, it hits the retina, it gets to the visual cortex, that is automatic. There's nothing you can do about that. But once you're at that stage, so once the sensory activation is there, it could be that you already have a bunch of predictions on what you are likely going to see, and that could interact with the sensory activation, if we believe in a model like this, right? There is a big school of thought within cognition as well, which says this is nonsense. There's cognitive impenetrability, so these basic cognitive stages like seeing, feeling, tasting, hearing, they're not influenced by what you already know. That only happens later. So yeah, I mean, this you shouldn't. I don't want to.
So one of the manipulations would be to prime people, say like this is going to be about politics, or it's going to be about faces.
Yeah, indeed.
In order to get the politics predictions in.
Yeah. So one study that I want to do is like show people meaningless stimuli, like these. I think this is what your postdoc is also doing with this little marble task, basically, where you have these marbles. If you show people a bunch of black and white dots, they don't mean anything. But if you tell them, these black and white dots actually represent, I don't know, voting behavior, then you might have very specific preconceptions about how you want the world to look like how people are voting. So once you change a meaningless stimulus to a meaningful, politically meaningful stimulus, it would be really interesting to see, does it change anything about what you perceive? Does it change anything about how you evaluate it? See what's going on there. I think that's one way to go about it. Indeed, taking something meaningless and adding meaning to it, political meaning. Another way of going about it is indeed taking a face which is neutral and putting, I don't know, a political layer on top of it. Like saying, this is actually a face of somebody who votes for democracy. And then, how does that change what you saw?
Great. Yeah. Okay. Hey, we're going to the Q&A box. You can actually also read along if you press on it. But I'll first do Maaike's question. Maaike Holman, who's one of the PhD students in our lab and works on emotion recognition, among other things. Thanks for your presentation. Related to the question from Gijs, I was wondering how your prediction model relates to other outcomes, such as physiological responses. People in politics often have emotional physiological response to certain stimuli that are also influenced by prior knowledge. I was wondering how these emotional responses fit in the model. Do people first consciously perceive the stimulus and then get aroused, or do these emotional responses already happen at the same time?
Yes, I think that is much more related to, if you think about the emotional system, then I guess than to perception per se. I mean, yeah, you can think about this in different ways. If we are thinking about this in a black box kind of way, like you have no preconceptions and you just see the stimulus, then I would say we need to approach this just from how the brain processes emotional stimuli. And there you do see that you don't need to be aware of stimuli to have an emotional response to it. So it could be subconscious. We have this fast route to the emotional response, but this is for sort of highly emotional stimuli. So stimuli that have more complex information, like perhaps the political convictions. In that regard, I think the emotional evaluation is really that. It's an evaluation that follows the perception. So you need to first process the stimulus, then you can evaluate. And then this also includes the emotional response. But I would say it's a bit of an open question. I don't know if there's much work into this subconsciously presented political stimuli and whether you still have emotional responses. You could think about continuous flash suppression, where you present a stimulus that is visible to one eye, but made invisible, sort of not consciously accessible by presenting flashing images to the other eye, and then see whether you still get these, emotional responses to them. That's a pretty sort of deep way of making stimuli invisible, but yet still accessible to the system. But you could also think about masking. I think usually masking studies are a bit more logical in that regard. I don't know. I don't really know about that. So I can't really answer your question with much authority, I'm afraid.
Gijs has raised his hand. I assume this is in response to this. Is it
Yeah,
in
but
response to this?
get to the question.
Okay, now okay, then first I'll go to Luca Versteven's question. Luca will actually be presenting some of his ongoing work end of June in our last Graduate Friday, so stay tuned for that. But here's his question. Thanks for this interesting presentation. Can we assume the same level of sensory activation for all stimuli? Could it be possible that sensory activation already varies depending on whether one likes the stimulus? For example, the threshold for noticing Trump is higher than for Clinton.
I think, again, great question. I cannot answer this from a political perspective, but I can answer it, for example, from cases that we have negative or positive information about. So there are these studies done where you pair specific cases of people that you didn't know before with information about them which put them in a very negative or positive light, like basically, oh, this person beat up their neighbor, or this person helped an old lady, so to say. And people learn these associations, and then indeed these stimuli are presented subconsciously, and you measure how long it takes for them to enter awareness. And there are a few studies that show that I think it is the positive stimuli. I forgot what the direction is of the effect. There is a difference between the positively valence phases and the negatively valence phases. But now I don't remember whether the negatively valence phases sort of pop out, from a threat perspective, or whether they take longer than the positive phases. I only remember that there is a difference. So that's a bit sloppy. But yeah, so that way it seems that you can change based on what we know about the person, that how do you call that? Indeed, well, what you're saying, that the sensory, the activation level differs depending on what we already know. So you could do the same thing indeed with politicians.
Yeah.
Put them in these sort of backward masking or continuous flash suppression situation where you don't initially consciously perceive them. I mean, it would be a fun study to do.
Great, thanks, Marte. Next question is from Tobias Rohrbach. Question is this: the gendered link between women and witches is interesting as an example. Would gender incongruent examples work as well? In other words, Trump and a witch. Yeah,
so the example, what I wanted to highlight there was that people might have these associations already. So this is not a priming study. This is just knowledge that might already be present in a person's head before they go out into the world and encounter visual stimuli. So if we talk about negativity associations, then we talk about a more priming approach, and then probably the negative valence of the word witch. If you have a negative, how do you call that? A negative view of Trump, you could probably prime Trump with witch. I think that is not a problem because both have negative valence. So in that regard, probably the priming would be stronger if you have a negative view of Hillary Clinton and you prime that with witch, because in the semantic network, these will be more closely related, right? if we think about semantic networks and which words are related to each other, for Trump, if you have a negative view of Trump, that would only be the negative D-link. In case of if you have a negative view of Hillary Clinton, the gender link will also be present. So there will be more connections within the semantic system.
Great. Now I'll go over to Diamantis. That's the top question. Diamantis is a postdoc in lab working with Gijs on host of.
I stole his idea of the marble task.
Oh, right. Oh, you know Diamantis, right? Yeah, sorry. It's Friday afternoon and after the first working week. All right, this question is from Diamantis. A subsequent question regarding the magnitude of the prediction error response reaching consciousness. To what extent does the conflicting stimulus need to be registered, in other words, conscious, in order for a prediction error signal to be recorded?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I think within the model of predictive processing, it doesn't need to be conscious. So the original idea of predictive processing is a very automatic one, right? You have a prediction, you perceive the outside world, the resulting percept can be a mix of your prediction and the percept, but if there is a mismatch with your prediction and the incoming sensory information, the prediction error automatically feeds back into the system and should change your priors. Now, this is a very interesting assumption because, well, let's talk about my field of prejudice and stereotype. We don't see that these types of how do you call that, prediction errors don't really seem to change stereotypes and prejudice that much. I mean, we should encounter a lot of counterexamples in the real world that do not consistently behave with our stereotypes, and yet they seem to be persistent against these kinds of counterexamples. So we seem at some level not really adequately process these prediction errors when it comes to social knowledge, social priors. And I guess the same goes for politics, right? Even when we see politicians from the other side do stuff that we might think is good, that doesn't immediately feed back into the system and change our priors about that political party. So at some level, social knowledge does seem to be, I don't know, almost, yeah, in that regards, maybe this whole predictive processing approach is not really the way to go about it, because at that level, at the level of changing our priors, we don't really seem to behave in that way. So perhaps that is an attention thing, that we just don't pay attention to stuff that is outside of our predictions. Perhaps we actively discount it, and indeed that would, how do you call that, point to an idea that you need to be conscious and you need to be sort of in agreement with these prediction errors for them to have an effect on your priors. So yeah, maybe I'm talking too long about this, but this is something that I have been thinking about because this was a bit of a problem, this whole idea that perhaps predictive processing plays a role at the level of social functioning.
Yep, cool. Thanks. Okay, Marte, I think I'm going to hand over the floor to Gijs for the final wrap up, but I also want to take the opportunity to thank you for this excellent presentation. And you know, we have some exciting things in the pipeline. Some will materialize, others might not, but I hope we can continue these interesting discussions. So Gijs, floor is yours for the last words of today.
Yeah, thank you, Marte. This is really interesting, and I think there's really a lot of ground for us to collaborate on, and I'm looking forward to having more face-to-face real conversations in the near future. Leaves me with, of course, telling you that you will get the Hot Politics Lab coffee mug. And I also have a little bit of news that there will be special Hot Politics Lab coffee mugs distributed probably to our American participants in one of the conferences that I think I'll be unlikely to go to this year, but and these will be sponsored by the Association for Politics and Life Sciences, and will be distributed by Patrick Stewart. You, Marte, as I literally only need to cross a bridge, will get the old-fashioned. Also, there's a bit of a cultural difference between an American coffee mug and a Dutch one, so I think you'll get the one you would like to have. Hey, what's up for next week's January 21? Next week, Friday, we have Nathalie Giger, who's from the University of Geneva, but is actually spending this year in Amsterdam. What a great time to be here. She will talk about perceptions of inequality and their links to ideology among political elites and citizens. The week after, we have Israel Weismel Manor from the University of Haifa, and he will talk about from corruption to cyberspace, expanding what we study and how we study it. Then moving to February, Christoph van Eck from the Communication Science Department, conceptualizing online climate change polarization will be her talk. Then we move to Amelie Godefroid. We have a PhD Graduate Friday session with Maaike Homan and Chiara Vialli, the end of February. Then we move to March. We have Matthijs Roda, we have Yiv Lelkes, we have Josh Kella, and a lot more very interesting speakers coming up. Rune Slothuis, Chris Dawes, Arvid Kappas, and Han van der Maas will talk at one point, Flavia Acevedo, and of course, several more meetings where PhD students have the opportunity to present their research. So that's it for today. I want to thank everyone for being here, for participating, and hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll also have a physical presence again in the office with a small group. If not, and then of course we need to smuggle in some beers because the bars are still closed, but who knows? Or we drive to South Limburg because I hear there that they're opening the bars even though it's not allowed. Or Belgium, there we can drink as much as we want, as I found out last week. Anyway, that's a wholly different topic. Hope to see you next week, and have a good weekend.